Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting... What? I just need this to hunt rats. Yeah, that's it. Alright. Well, in this exciting visual effects tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a cool looking first-person 3D scan, just like the one that we used in our Minecraft in real life short film. This is going to be an intermediate tutorial, and I will assume that you have at least watched my entire beginner series for how to use Adobe After Effects, as well as my tutorial on how to use the 3D camera tracker. But now, before I get caught for anything else, let's jump right into the tutorial. Welcome to the wonderful world of Adobe After Effects, and as always I am going to start out with an empty composition. The clip we will be using for this tutorial is called park.mp4, and as always you can download this file from the description of the video if you want to follow along. Let's start out by dragging this clip into our composition, and because this clip is a little bit too short for my composition, I'm just going to go to the end, press N to mark the end point, and then simply right click on the header here and select Trim Comp to Work Area. The clip itself is a very simple first-person shot that we filmed in the Royal Botanical Gardens in Melbourne, and in this tutorial we're going to track a 3D scan into this shot. The very first thing we need to do is we need to track our footage. For that, simply come into the Effects and Presets panel, search for the 3D Camera Tracker effect and apply it to the layer. I am going to speed this up just so you don't have to sit through this. If this takes a little bit on your computer, go grab a coffee, play with the kids or feed the cats. Tracking is done, and here are all of the track points, so let's check this out. And that actually looks pretty good, but I am a little bit concerned that I can see all of the track points kind of change through as I look down and up. And also the track points down here on the ground are really small, and I would expect these track points to be a whole lot larger than the ones on the tree, because these on the ground here are a lot closer to the camera. Now, if you go ahead and select a whole bunch of track points, right click and select Create Solid in Camera, the solid itself, the track solid, let's scale this up a little bit, something isn't right, the scale is way off, so I'm going to delete the track solid and the 3D camera tracker again. Let's reselect the park clip and the 3D camera tracker, and something has gone wrong in the interpretation of our 3D space by the 3D camera tracker. And people tend to assume that the 3D camera tracker will just always work out of the box. In this particular case, it did not. One thing you can always do in the 3D camera tracker, let's expand the advanced tab, and you can check out the average error, and 0.85 pixels is actually pretty good. It means that the average slip of track points from their pixels that they're tracking is only 0.85 pixels. So the track points themselves are good, so the footage quality is good for tracking, but the solving of the camera is incorrect. In the effect settings under method used, you will see that the 3D camera tracker used a mostly flat scene mode to solve this 3D space, which didn't work out so well. When we filmed this footage, and you can actually see this from the clip, we didn't actually move. We kind of just aimed the camera around from one spot. This particular type of shot is actually called a pan tilt zoom. It's also sometimes called a tripod pan because the camera isn't moving forward or backwards. There is no parallaxing happening in your scene, and so the 3D camera tracker does struggle to figure out the depth in your scene. Now what I'm going to do, instead of using the solve method auto detect, I'm actually going to drop this down to tripod pan because I know that's the type of shot we're working with here. Let's click that. And the 3D camera tracker has resolved our scene as a tripod pan, and you can see that all of the track points are now equal sized, and you'll get this notice here, no depth from a tripod pan solve, and that's because there was no parallaxing in the scene, because the camera didn't physically move around, means the 3D camera tracker couldn't figure out the depth, but in a pan tilt zoom shot or a tripod pan, it doesn't actually matter. We can work with this, so let's just scrub through, and you can see that all of the track points are following the features that they're tracking nicely, so this will work just fine for our 3D scan. So let's get cracking. First, let's define a plane for the ground. For that, I'm going to select a few track points that are lying on the ground, so maybe that one, this one, and the one over on the right here. So that's not actually too bad. Let's just right click and create a new solid and camera. And if you scrub through the composition, yep, you can see that this solid is tracked nicely into our shot. Now obviously it's not at all aligned with our ground plane, so I might select it and let's rotate it a little bit to kind of just at least have it be a bit more aligned to the ground. I'm going to rotate it a little bit as well, just as kind of aimed at the location where we're standing. And I might just flatten it out a little bit. By the way, if these controls are a little bit too fidgety, you can just reveal the orientation on the layer itself. And if you hold down Control on your keyboard, you can actually make much more fine-grained adjustments to this. So just kind of align it as best as we can with the ground. That's not actually too bad. So this is kind of the plane defined for where I want this 3D scan to happen. So that actually looks pretty good. Next, we need to create the actual grid effect that we want to animate and overlay into the 3D space of our scene. For that, let's return to the project panel and let's create a new composition. I'm going to call this one Grid Comp. And I might actually increase the width and height a little bit because I am a bit concerned that we're going to track this into the shot, so the resolution needs to be fairly high. So maybe I'll jack this up to 3000 in width, which then takes 1688 pixels in height. Let's just hit OK. And here is a new composition. Let's start out by creating a new solid. Let's call this one Grid. And let's change the color over to black, though it doesn't actually matter too much. So here's a new black solid. Looks exactly the same as our background. But now let's search for and apply a grid effect. Here is our basic grid, and I kind of want to increase the number of cells because it's a little bit too coarse for me for that. In the grid effect itself, let's change the size from drop down from corner point over to width slider. And so now you get the slider that controls the size of your grid. I don't want to get it too small, but also not too big. Maybe around the 60. I think that's actually quite a good size. And if I zoom in a little bit, maybe the grid lines are a little bit too thick for me. So I might actually bring this border property in just a tiny bit, maybe to 3. So it's just a little bit finer. It'll look a bit more delicate and just a bit more tacky that way. In my opinion, obviously feel free to tweak this in any way that you want. And now, obviously the grid doesn't animate yet. We need to kind of animate a sweeping grid effect from the bottom to the top because that's how we're going to align it in the 3D space of our shot to kind of, sweep across the floor. For that, we're simply going to use a track matte. So let's create a new solid layer. Let's call this one Grid Matte. Hit OK. And let's apply a mask to the middle of this layer. So this is going to be the area of the grid that we're going to be revealing, and we're going to animate this layer to kind of move across. Next, let's expand the mask and let's kind of feather it out along the edges. And you can kind of see, if I zoom in a little bit, you get this nice soft grid effect. And don't worry, we're going to invert that in a second. So that's about what it looks like. It's not too bad. Let's collapse the grid matte again. And on the grid itself, let's change the track matte option over to alpha matte. So now what we just have this strip of grid. And I can actually bring in this mask here. Maybe I'll make it a bit thinner. Cool. And so now if I move this mask around, you can kind of see this grid effect come through. You can also move the entire layer if you wanted to. Personally, I think I'm just going to move the mask. Seems a bit easier. So let's come to the beginning of the composition. Press M to reveal the mask. Enable the keyframes for the mask path property, and let's double click the outside of the mask to select it, and let's just drag it off the screen on the bottom. Let's come forward to maybe about a second and a little bit, and let's move this mask all the way across the screen and off to the top. So we have it essentially just kind of swipe across from bottom to top. And what I might do at around 2 seconds, I think I might want this to do another sweep. So let's go back a frame from 2 seconds. So I'm at 123. Let's copy and paste the last keyframe from our mask path, which is where the mask is still at the top. Let's go forward a frame and let's just copy and paste this whole movement in again. So we're kind of snapping back to the bottom and sweeping across again. And again, let's go to 4 seconds and 1 frame back. And again, I'm just going to copy and paste this whole thing in. So we do another sweep. And let's do another one around the 6 seconds. And you can obviously animate this with any speed that you want. I kind of just have a number of different sweeps now going across. Let's just play this back. Cool, and so you're starting to get an idea of what this sweep might look like. Now let's return to our main composition and let's replace this solid here on the ground with this actual grid. For that, let's open up the project panel and let's collapse the track solid. And with this track solid selected, come into your project panel and hold down Alt on your keyboard, or I believe it's Option on the Mac, and then drag and drop the grid comp onto the track solid to essentially replace it. So let's let go. And now if I scrub through, you can see this grid pattern being swept across the ground. Obviously you can see this is now the plane, this is the actual grid, so it's a whole lot bigger than the one we had before. So you kind of see this cool 3D sweep going across our scene. I feel it's not really well aligned though, so I might actually rotate this just a little bit more. Maybe again I'll reveal the orientation and rotate this through here. I'll just get a bit more fine control that way. So kind of just align this with the edge of the garden down in the distance. Just looks a bit nicer. Cool, that's actually pretty good. Now the other things I want to do, for one, on my grid comp, I'm going to change my mode from normal over to additive. It just kind of gives the grid a little bit more glowy intensity. It just feels a bit more sci-fi technical that way. And I might actually just adjust the color of my base footage a little bit, just so that the grid effect stands out a little. For that, let's select the park clip. Maybe we'll drain some color out first. Let's apply a hue and saturation effect to it. I'm going to bring down the master saturation just a little bit. And maybe I'm going to twist the hue a little bit more into the greenish. So I'm kind of getting this more green tinted techie look. And let's also apply a curves effect to the park clip. And maybe I'm just going to bring down the highlights a little bit, just so it's a bit darker, a little bit more, slightly more contrasty. It just kind of stands out a little bit nicer. I think it just kind of looks a bit cooler with this grid now sweeping across. Sweet, that actually looks pretty cool already. Obviously, for one, there are a number of issues right now that we still need to fix, and that is that you can see the grid going over the tree here and on the side and kind of a little bit across the bushes in the distance. So that is one thing we need to fix. Also here on the side you can kind of see it just going over the tree. But also, while this does feel quite 3D already, one thing I would really like to add is kind of as the grid hits these trees in the foreground, you get this scanning effect going up the trees as well, just to give this effect a bit more depth, and it'll just look a little bit more interesting. So what we need to do for that, we need to create mats for the left tree and for the right tree. And obviously you could also do it for the trees a bit further back and blend them in, but I'm going to leave that up to you. We're just going to do the front two trees because personally, because the effect is quite quick, that's probably going to be sufficient. But obviously feel free to extend this and build on top of it and just let me know what your end result is. But for now, let's just focus on the front two trees. With the park clip still selected, let's come up in the effect parameters and reselect the 3D camera tracker. This will then re-reveal all of the track points on our footage. And let's create a solid for this tree here on the left side. So let's select a couple of track points that are kind of on the surface of this tree. That's probably not too bad. Right click, create a new solid. And let's rename this solid to left tree. And if you scrub through, this should follow the movement of your camera nicely. Now, because we are going to use a mask to cut out the shape of the tree from this solid, I need to make sure that it's high enough resolution. Otherwise, the edges might turn out really ugly and blocky. For that, you can either select your layer, come up into layer and then solid settings. Personally, I'm a big fan of keyboard shortcuts, so Ctrl-Shift-Y it is for me. So let's unselect that, make sure the layer is selected. Ctrl-Shift-Y to bring up the solid settings. And yeah, you can see width and height is 270 pixels. That's definitely not going to be enough. So I'm going to jack this up to 2000 by 2000, which obviously makes for a pretty huge solid. So let's lower the opacity a little bit so we can kind of see through it. And let's scale it down as well. I want to make sure that this covers the entire extent of the tree throughout the entire shot. So yeah, that's looking all right. Maybe I'll move it over just a little bit to make sure the solid covers all branches of this tree. Cool, I'm quite happy with that. Let's move forward until the entire tree is in the shot as much as it can. I think towards the end here, that's probably as good as it gets. Let's zoom in a little bit and let's grab the pen tool and draw a mask around the shape of this tree. I am going to include all of the branches in the foreground for this tree because I want the 3D scan to kind of go up the branches as well. I'm doing a bit of a rough job here, obviously, and I'm going to include a bit of the sky and just do a few things that, you know, feel free to go in and tweak them and kind of take that out as well. I just want to give you an idea of how to set this up, but I don't want to spend hours masking everything out in fine detail. So feel free to spend some more time on this. I'm just going to go a bit rough around the outside of the branches. Also, personally, because this is going to be a pretty quick 3D scan effect, you're probably not going to notice too much, even if this is just a little bit off. What I might do though is I might add a second mask just kind of on the inside here to cut out a little bit of this hole where you can see the sky, just so it's a little bit easier. And then on my masks, I'm going to set the second mask to subtract to kind of cut that hole back out. I think I'll just look just that little bit nicer. Next, let's select both masks, press MM to reveal the mask path properties, and I'm going to add a bit of feather to the outside one, maybe 5 pixels, and the inner one I think I'm going to make a bit softer, just kind of so that the hole that I'm cutting in isn't quite as noticeable. I'm going to drag this in a little bit, just kind of blur this out a bit, so we got a bit of a hole in the middle, but it'll be nice and soft around the edges. And finally, let's reselect our layer, press T to reveal the opacity, and let's drag that back up to 100. And there you go, that's now our first tree layer cut out. And it's not perfect, I can kind of see it bleeding a little bit over the edge here, but I don't think it's that big a deal. We probably won't be noticing that too much. So there you go, that's not too bad, a very pretty tree on the left side. And let's repeat this process for the tree on the right. Let me zoom back out and find the spot where the tree on the right side is as visible as it gets, which is probably right about here where I'm looking over to the right hand side. Let's again reselect the park clip and the 3D camera tracker to get all of the track points. And this time I'm going to select some track points on the right tree, maybe these 4. Right click and create a new solid. Let's rename this one to right tree. And again, make sure that the resolution of this solid is high enough, so Ctrl-Shift-Y to bring up the solid settings. And again, that won't do, so let's jack this up to 2000 by 2000 pixels. Hit OK. Reveal the opacity, and let's bring that down a little bit. And again, let's bring the size. I want to make sure that this covers the entire tree, obviously, and this one has quite wide branches, so make sure that the entire tree is covered by the solid. Move it up just a tad. And I might actually rotate it just a little bit because I feel it's not quite upright. So, yep, I think that's looking fine. So let's come back. And again, grab the pen tool, and let's draw a mask for the outline of this tree. Cool, that's probably good enough. Maybe I'll just tweak the edges a little bit. And on the mask, let's reveal the mask properties and just increase the feather to maybe 5 to 10, somewhere just not too noticeable. Let's reveal the opacity on the layer and jack this back up to 100. And now let's zoom back out. We should now have 2 beautiful trees in the middle of our shot. Maybe I'll just tweak this a tad more to get the rest of the trunk of the tree here. And now we need to use these 2 colorful cardboard cutouts to cover up the 3D scan that is going over the top of the tree trunks. For that, I'm going to pre-compose these 2 layers, but before I do that, because I want to reuse them a bit later, I'm first going to duplicate both of them, drag that to the top, and I'm going to hide those 2. So let's select the left tree and the right tree and pre-compose those layers. I'm going to call this one Tree Matte Comp, and let's hit OK. And you will notice that suddenly your layers are kind of misaligned and they're no longer tracked into the shot, and that's because inside this Tree Matte Comp we obviously don't have a camera, so the tracking doesn't apply, but you can simply reveal the layer switches and enable the collapse transformation switch on the Track Matte Comp, and everything will pop back into place because now the layers that are inside this comp are essentially treated as if they were part of this particular composition. So now everything is nice and tracked properly again. And finally, on the grid comp, let's change the track matte over to alpha inverted. And now if you scrub through the composition, you will notice that the 3D scan no longer goes over the base of the trees because that's essentially where our masks are sitting and kind of covering that up. So it looks a bit more realistic as the scans are kind of going around the tree trunk. Obviously, you will still notice it on some trees in the background. And again, feel free to add mattes for those as well and kind of cover up all of the little details and all the weird little things that are happening in the background. Personally, I think it's probably not that important because it is a pretty quick scan effect. And for most short film projects, this will probably be sufficient. But now, the one thing I still want to do is that as the scan hits these trees on the foreground, I want the scan to go up the trees as well. I kind of want the foreground trees to kind of get this 3D effect going up and over the branches as well, just because it'll add a whole bunch more depth into this effect and just makes it look a little bit more interesting and just a little bit more realistic. Obviously, this isn't really a true 3D scan effect. It's an approximation of a 3D scan. If you want the full tamale, you'd probably have to rebuild the entire scene in 3D, generate an actual 3D scan, and then overlay that back onto your footage. This obviously is a fairly simplistic way of achieving this effect, but Quite honestly, for most short film projects that you might be working on, this is likely sufficient. So now let's add a little vertical scan going up the trees here on the left side. And for that, let's reselect our park footage and the 3D camera tracker, and let's create a new plane that sits vertically between these two trees. So I'm going to select a few checkpoints on the left side here and a few on the right side. And because there is no depth in the tracking data, it doesn't really matter which ones, like even if I click on one that sits on a tree in the background, it's still at the same depth. It doesn't really make much of a difference. I'm just going to try to find some that kind of make this as vertically aligned as I can, so that actually looks pretty good. Let's simply right click and create a new solid. And this one I'm going to call vertical grid. And with this vertical grid layer still selected, let's come back to our project panel. Grab the grid comp and again hold down Alt on your keyboard before you grab it, then drag and drop that onto your vertical grid to replace it. And probably hard to see, there it is. So there's the vertical grid. Seems a bit close. I'm going to push it back a fair bit. I just kind of needed to cover up the tree here on the left side. So there you go, and the tree on the right side. It's a bit, see how it's not quite extending the length of the tree. Not sure whether you can actually see it because just as the scan comes up, the camera moves away. But I'm just going to bring it forward maybe a little bit more again, just so make sure that the trees are covered with the full scan. So that actually looks pretty good. And now what I'm going to do is drag this below the left tree. And remember, the left tree is just this mat. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this vertical grid and I might actually split this. I'm going to create one for the left and one for the right tree, just so I can rotate them in any way that I want separately, because the angle on the left tree and the angle on the right tree are slightly different. I'll just make it a bit, gives you a bit more control. So with this lined up now, I just need to make sure that I've got the left tree covered here. I can probably push this back a little bit more if I want this a bit smaller. Let's just hide the mat for a second. So I'm just trying to get this grid aligned with the left tree. Yeah, I think that looks all right. Now let's enable the mat for the left tree so we can see what's going to happen. So there's the mat for the tree. And now the last thing to do on the vertical grid, let's come over and change the track mat over to alpha mat. So now you have this scan going over the tree. So this kind of just adds a little bit of depth. And the one thing I want to do is, you can see that the scan is coming up a little bit too quick. The scan on the ground hasn't even reached the tree trunk yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to drag this forward a little bit to delay this effect, so it kind of happens just as this ground scan comes through, so it kind of is like it's going up that tree and gives you a bit more of that depth feeling. Maybe I'll drag the layer forward just a little bit more. So just like that, that's actually looking pretty cool. I might actually rename this vertical grid to vertical grid left. So I know that this is the grid for the left tree. That looks pretty cool. And let's do the same for the right tree. I'm simply going to duplicate this vertical grid left, and I'm going to call this vertical grid right. Let's come over and let's grab and drag this over to the right side. And let's make sure that I can see the scan. So there's the scan. I'm just going to align this time-wise. And you can see that because when we duplicated it, it has already applied a track mat from our right tree automatically, just because of the way I had the layers placed. But just make sure that you essentially duplicate the vertical grid left, rename it, move it over to the tree on the right side. And what I might do, I might actually rotate this a little bit, just because it feels a little bit misaligned with the tree. And this is why it's actually a good idea to have separate grid layers for the left and the right tree, because it gives me a whole lot more control now. So let's just align this again with this tree a little bit nicer. And then obviously change this to an alpha mat and make sure that the mat for the right tree sits right above that layer. So you now got the scan going up the right tree as well. And again, let's just time-wise align them so that you get this scan coming up right as it's being hit here. So there's the scan going up. Cool, that's actually looking really nice now. Now the last thing I want to tweak is actually the fact that the scans going up the trees do look a little bit flat. It looks like it's going up that cardboard cutout, which, well, technically that's exactly what's happening, right? We've just made a cardboard cutout of the tree and we've kind of overlaid this vertical scan onto it. So it just looks a little bit flat. And again, I'm going to go a fairly simple way of fixing this, but it's just going to add a little bit more detail and just make it look and feel just a little bit more three-dimensional. So let's select the vertical grid on the left side and let's search for and apply a bulge effect to it. If you drag this center around, you can already see it's kind of distorting this grid a little bit. And I want to place one on the tree trunk and kind of increase the horizontal radius a little bit and just push it up to kind of cover the tree trunk and see what it's doing. This is flat. This kind of feels rounded. I mean, yes, it's fake, right? It's just an illusion, like pretty much everything in visual effects, but it just adds that little bit of detail. It just makes the tree and the scan itself look a little bit more interesting, like it's actually wrapping around that tree. Now, you can see that the branches are still flat, and you can add a little bit of variance into it. Obviously, they're not really round, but I just don't want them to feel quite this flat, and you can use different distortion effects for that. Personally, I don't mind just duplicating my bulge effect. Let's just drag this over here, and let's just tweak it a little bit. Let's make it a little bit thinner, but a little bit wider. Maybe not quite as high on the bulge either, just a little bit. Kind of just drag it over the right-hand side to just kind of push out these branches just a little bit. It'll just add a little bit of interest to it. Let's duplicate this bulge again, and let's do the same here on the left side. And again, I'm just going to tweak this a little. Feel free to play with this. You can also just say, oh, I don't really want this type of effect. But for me, it just makes it look a little bit more interesting and just not so flat. So that's not actually too bad. Let's unselect and scan through. So there you go. It just kind of looks a little bit more three-dimensional on this tree. And again, we can do the same thing for the tree on the right side. Let's take the vertical grid right. I'm just going to drag this to get that scan happening so I can see what's going on. And let's again apply a bulge effect. Drag this to where the trunk is, and let's push this out horizontally and vertically just to go a bit rounded around the trunk. Maybe I'll duplicate that and just push one up further at the top as well. Just somewhere there. This kind of looks a bit nicer. And again, let's duplicate it, drag it out, a bit wider, a bit higher. Yep, that's not too bad. Maybe not quite as tall. Duplicate, place one on the right side. Maybe you can even bulge negative if you want, but it looks a bit weird. So again, just kind of feel like tweaking this, and let's copy another one for the top. And it just looks a little bit more interesting. Obviously, it's not perfect, but you know, nobody's really going to notice. So let's realign those two layers. Again, I think this one was a little bit later, like a frame or so, just to have that ground scan aligned right there. Yep, that actually looks all right. So now let's rewind the composition, zoom back out, and let's check this out. And that is actually looking pretty cool. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to kind of tweak the color a little bit, because it does feel a little bit, it's just not techy enough, right? I mean, the white is nice, but it doesn't have the same impact. Let's select the grid comp first, and I might actually rename this to ground grid. And in my effects and presets panel, I'm going to search for the VC color vibrance effect, which is a free plugin you can get from Video Copilot. So you can just download that and use that, but you can also use any other effect to kind of discolor in your grid. Just apply this to the ground grid layer, and you will see that the grid takes on this nice glowy green. But I might actually change this over to just be a little bit more bluish, just because I like this bluish techie feel. Cool, that's quite nice. And maybe I'll also apply a glow effect. And I'm going to use the stylized glow, which is inbuilt into After Effects, so you will have that available. And even on the default settings, that actually looks pretty cool already. So I might just leave it here. Feel free to tweak this in any way you want. Let's simply select the VC color vibrance and the glow, copy them, and let's paste them on the vertical grid left tree, so that'll be the left glow. Also, I'm just noticing that this layer is still in normal blend mode. I want to change this over to add, so it kind of adds that glow over the tree. And let's do the same thing for the one on the right side. So let's select the vertical right grid, paste the effects onto it, and let's change the blend mode over to additive. And that looks pretty cool. Now, the very last thing that I always recommend if you're compositing visual effects together, especially into a real life shot, I always like to apply color grading or color correction to all of the layers together, because it kind of glues them together. It makes them feel a whole lot more cohesive. For that, let's create a new adjustment layer. Let's place this one at the very top, and let's call this one grading. And you can apply any sort of color correction or color adjustment effects or color grading, any plugins you want on top of this. In the latest version of Adobe After Effects, I'm very excited, we have the Lumetri color effect. So I'm going to apply that to my grading layer, and that gives me a whole bunch of different controls. I'm going to bring down the exposure just a tad and bump up the contrast a little bit more. And then under creative, I can apply a whole bunch of different looks, which is kind of like magic bullet looks. So there's a whole bunch of cool ones in here. Maybe I'll try a different one. Yeah, cool. There's kind of a bit of a retro-y look. but it's kind of blending all of those effects together because they're all being processed in the same way, and it gives all of them the same flavor, and it makes everything fit together a little bit nicer. Obviously, it's a matter of taste, but I kind of like this effect. I think it looks pretty cool. So let's go back to the very beginning of our composition and play back our final 3D scan effect. And that's all there is to it. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please show your support by liking, favoriting and sharing it with the world. If you do want to see some more cool filmmaking and visual effects tutorials just like this one, please consider subscribing. And as always, if you do have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.